Hey guys, Richard Holdner here, and welcome to the channel. I'm really excited today because it's 346 pack time. That's right, a 346 pack, not even a 446 pack, which in my opinion is even more common, but the ultimate small block, the best 340 Dodge ever made. Let's check it out. In this video, we're going to compare the Dodge 346 pack, from the AAR Cuda or the TA Challenger, to some muscle car small blocks from Chevrolet, including the DZ302, the 365 horse 327, aka L76, or the LT1 350. We're also going to compare the 346 pack to a couple of Ford motors, namely the Boss 302 and the Boss 351. So what do you think? How does the 340 compare? Let's find out. Okay guys, who's ready for the Dodge 346 pack versus the world? We're going to start out with a 346 pack. And before we get going, a special shout out and thanks to Steve Brule and Ish over at West Tech, who got me all of this data and actually filmed this. They got the video for me while the motor was running, because they were actually testing this motor for a customer. The guys at Mazzolini Racing, who do lots of very, very cool Dodge stuff. They're out drag racing and setting records and stuff. And this motor was actually for a customer. So it wasn't something that we built specifically for this test, but I was just lucky enough to happen upon it. So this is awesome stuff. 346 pack, maybe one of my favorite Dodge motors. But, and there's always a but, this thing is not an exact replica of a factory one. First of all, it's 30 or 40 over, which is okay because the other motors that I'm comparing it to, all of the Chevys and the two of the Fords, were all at least 30 or 40 over, so that's not a big concern. What does concern me, now the 340 has, it has the X heads, it has the right rockers, it has the 6-pack with the 3 Holley carburetors on it. It's obviously, as we mentioned, the right displacement. It has the right block and crank and all of that stuff. So really, it's a pretty good representation. The things that are different, one, it has a different camshaft. And as a reproduction of the 340 camshaft, and that's from Comp Cams. So I'll go ahead and put the specs up here on the cam that came from Comp. And as you can see, it's different than a factory 340 cam. Now, there were two 340 cams that were offered, and the thing is, after all of my investigation, I still have not been able to conclusively figure out which camshaft they put in the 6-pack. Some people are telling me that it's the 340 automatic cam, and some are telling me that it's the 340 manual cam. Now, the one that they used in the manual is bigger. The automatic cam was the 268, 276 duration cam, and the manual cam was, according to the information, the 276, 284 camshaft. So if somebody out there knows, make sure to make a comment and let me know which one they actually put in the 6-pack. The Comp Cams was a little bit different, so I'll go ahead and show you the specs here. And I think that that's kind of why we're seeing a little more power than I would expect to have from a 346 pack motor. In my estimation, it would be lower than this, but this makes for a cool a comparison, because the other thing that this had that's a little bit different, this was only 9.5 to 1 compression. It was not the factory compression ratio, so we have a little less compression and probably a little more camshaft. So where does all that figure in? But it's still going to be an interesting comparison. So let's get going. This is our 346 pack motor. It was run with headers. It was run with the factory carburation, and this was all built again by the guys at Mazzolini Racing. So this thing made 371 horsepower, 370.9, and 376 foot-pounds of torque. So it did very well, making a lot more power actually than I originally thought that we would get from a 346-pack motor. But now let's find out how it compares to the following motors, because I ran all of these. A DZ302, a 365-horse 327, a 370-horse LT1 350, a Boss 302, and finally the Boss 351. Let's check it out. Now that we have what is a very impressive 346 pack motor, so again, let me know in the comments, what do you think? Do you think that this is representative of what the 340 actually makes? I mean, it has a little bit less compression than I think it should, obviously, than the factory specs, but I think it has a little more camshaft. So what do you guys think are the results of that? But in any case, let's compare it to some of the other muscle car motors that I ran at Westech under the same conditions. The first one is the very famous DZ302, and that obviously was the Trans Am racer back in 67, 68, and 69 that Chevrolet put together with a 3-inch stroke and a 4-inch bore. And as you can see, the DZ302 made good power. It made 357 horsepower. Torque checked in at 332 foot-pounds of torque. So it did fairly well. But as you can see, and we'll see this, and we saw this in the comparison. You can take a look at the video that I have up comparing this DZ302 to the 365 horse 327 and the LT1 350. And as we go up in displacement, it just makes a lot more torque and power up to the very peak. And this is exactly what happened. A 340 is a bigger motor. It has probably not as wild a cam timing, anywhere near as wild a cam timing as the DZ302 does. And it has, an equally good induction system, the 6-pack versus the 4-barrel combination that was used on the DZ302. But it's bigger, so it makes more torque than the 302. And that's the exact same thing that we saw when we compared the 327 to the 302 and the 350. Is as we went bigger in the motor, it just made a lot more average power production through most of the curve. So now let's take a look at how the 340 compares to the slightly larger 327. This is the 365 horse 327. And so a little bit closer in torque down low, but again, the 327, and it's got this weird dip in it, and it had it all the time, and I'm not quite sure what was going on. We had enough valve spring in it, because that's one of the things that we did was make sure, and that's one of the things that they had in the 340 also. It had enough valve spring in it to be able to run it. It looks like they didn't run the 340 in the testing past 6,000, but again, this was not done as a direct comparison. They were just running this as a customer's motor. But the 327 produced 353 horsepower, kind of on the same lines as the DZ302, and produced 368 foot-pounds of torque. But again, less than the 340, than this 340 anyway, less than the 340 basically everywhere. So now let's take a look at the final Chevrolet that we'll compare it to is the LT1 350 from 1970. And again, the big thing here is that the LT1 350 makes more torque than the 340. It's a bigger motor. It also had more compression. It had the LT1 had a smaller camshaft than either the DZ302 or the 365 horse 327. But it only made it in the 353 horsepower. Torque was way up though at 391 or 2 foot-pounds of torque. So again, here's a comparison between the 340 and the 350. The 350 made more power through a lot of the curve up to 47 or 4,800 RPM, and then it looks like the 340 made a little bit more, but I'm kind of pointing toward maybe the camshaft there, although again, the 346-pack was a good motor, so here is the comparison between these motors, the Chevy motors that I had. Now let's take a look and see how the 340 compares to the Ford. Okay guys, it looks like the 340, at least the one that we tested on the dyno, or the one that Westech did, the guys from Mazzolini Racing, did very well compared to the Chevys that I ran. Now let's see how it compares to the Ford. I have both a Boss 302 and the Boss 351. So if we take a look, this is our 340 6-pack motor, 371 horsepower, 376 foot-pounds of torque. And here is a comparison between a stock Boss 302, again, run with headers the way that we run it on the engine dyno. And just like the DZ302, we see that the bigger 340 basically makes more torque everywhere. Now everybody will point to, oh, that's because it's got the big Boss heads on it, but actually in a comparison between the DZ302 and the Boss 302, torque production is very comparable. In fact, the Boss did very well down low, even with the big Boss heads, because it has a smaller camshaft. It has a camshaft on the Boss 302, which is more in line with the camshaft run on the 346-pack. The DZ302 had poor head flow, in my opinion, but it had really wild camshaft, which allowed it to rev. On the Boss 302, it has way better cylinder heads than the 6-pack heads that are on the 340. That allowed it to actually make more peak power. It made 374 horsepower. Peak torque, though, was down to 324 foot-pounds. Again, 3-inch stroke and 302 inches versus 340 inches. So again, cubic inches kind of rule, especially when it comes to low-speed power production. So the Boss 302 was a high-revving deal. It made good power out at the top thanks to the cylinder heads. It had a dual-plane intake, but was able to rev thanks to the cylinder heads and mild cam timing. But looks like the 340 kind of has this covered. Now let's take a look at our final Boss, and that is the 1971 Boss 351. It's kind of overshadowed by the Boss 302 because the Boss 302 was Ford's darling and it won the Trans Am Championship, and so it's gone down as history. And in my opinion, a lot of guys like the body style much better on the 69 and 70 Boss 302 than they like the 71 Boss 351 body style. But the reality is the Boss 351, in all of my testing, has kind of been the high watermark of all of these factory small blocks, and I'll show you why. So the red is the Boss 351. Now the Boss 351, thanks to lots of head flow, I mean, to put it into perspective, a Boss 351 head flow is 275 CFM. So having that kind of airflow to work with makes it easy to make power and run in configuration that we ran this 340 in and all of these other muscle car motors. The Boss 351 made 383 horsepower and also made, because it's bigger than the 340, also made plenty of torque, despite the fact that it had big head ports, the big Boss 351 heads. It made 391 foot-pounds of torque. So in my opinion, the Boss, those 351 Cleveland heads, the 4V Cleveland heads, were a better match to the 351, although they seem to work fairly well on the Boss 302 as well. But here's our comparison between the 340 6-pack motor and the Boss 351, and what this shows is that the Boss 351 is still the most powerful factory small block, although I have not tested, obviously, a number of others, which I would like to. Maybe the stuff from AMC, obviously, to see how those things compare, because I've never run an AMC motor. That would be interesting to find out. Also, we could take a look at Pontiac and a number of others too, and we're just getting started. I actually want to do another 340 6-pack motor, one that's a little bit more representative, I think, of what they make. Maybe it does this, maybe it doesn't. Maybe if we up the compression and change the cam timing, maybe it does exactly the same thing. Maybe it does something different. But this is pretty cool. 6-pack versus Boss 351. Let's get to our conclusion. Okay, guys, what do we learn in our comparison between the Dodge 340 6-pack and all these other cool muscle car motors? First of all, we learned this. This wasn't an actual representation, I don't think, or a perfect representation of what a 340 6-pack is capable of. Short of having a time machine, which I would be definitely up for, even if they only allowed me to go back in time to dyno test the original motors and bring that data back, that would still be awesome. But this 340 was a little bit different than the factory stuff. Obviously, it had different camshaft, it had different compression. So is it exactly what a 340 6-pack would do? I don't know until we build another one and actually do testing. But it's still a cool comparison, comparing the 340 6-pack to the DZ, to the L76 and the LT1 and the Boss 302 and 351. So all cool stuff. But it does show this. That 340 was a player in 6-pack configuration and probably also in 4-barrel configuration, especially in the manual with the really good camshaft. I think that the 340 was a player. And if we go back and look, we see these 340 cars, they were runners. They were very fast. So this motor, awesomeness. I'm Richard Holder. Make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff. And obviously more testing is always coming